So which of the following is an application of being a faithful representation? Is it preparing group accounts? Is it the classification for debt and equity? Is it lease accounting for lessees? Now, before we have a look at each of those in turn, as to see whether or not they are a good example of an application of faithful representation, let me just clarify for a moment what I mean by faithful representation. Faithful representation is substance over form. Faithful representation is telling the truth, is using your judgment that sometimes following the legal form is not always the right thing to do to show a true and fair view. If we are faithfully representing something, we're making sure that the accounts are complete. Yeah. And it's a key fundamental characteristic of useful information. Information is only useful if it is both relevant and faithfully represented. No errors, a complete picture. So preparing group accounts, is that a practical example of a faithful representation? Legally, you see, when you have a parent and a sub, there are two separate entities. But because the parent controls the sub, if you want to have a complete picture of the resources that are under a single control, you've got to prepare group accounts. So group accounts exist in the mind and imagination of us all, rather than in a legal form. It's a bit like a family. It's a bit like a marriage. It's a bit like preparing a set of accounts for a group of people. You see, legally, we are separate individuals. But if we act together as one, as a parent and a sub will, then for stewardship and accountability and for completeness, we prepare group accounts. So preparing group accounts is a classic, is a really good example of substance over form, of giving a faithful representation. Excuse me. Now, the second example that I talked about there was debt and equity. So this is financial instruments. This is ISA 32. This is IFRS 9. And when we're raising finance, we're issuing a financial instrument. And we either have to say it's debt, that we've borrowed the money, that there's an obligation to repay it, and therefore we show a liability, which attracts a finance cost. Or alternatively, we say the monies we've received is because we've issued an equity instrument, because there's evidence of ownership in the residual assets. And therefore, any dividends that we pay are appropriations of profit. The classification of debt and equity must be done in accordance with the truth, must be done in accordance with the substance. Just because something is called a share doesn't mean to say it's equity. If we issue a redeemable share, if we issue a share where the holder has the right to ask us for our money back, ask them for their money back, we then would have an obligation to pay them that money back. So a redeemable share in those circumstances would be regarded as debt. We follow the substance. We have to faithfully represent what is going on. We are not subservient to the law. We have a higher calling as accountants. We want to show a true and fair view. So the classification of debt and equity is another classic example of substance over form, giving a faithful representation. Now, my third example was lease accounting. And I'm looking at this quite specifically from the perspective of the lessee. So a lease is a contract between two parties for the use of an asset specified, and it's between the owner, who is the lessor, who receives the cash, who owns the asset, and the lessee, who pays the money to rent the asset, to lease the asset, and takes possession of the asset. Now, under IFRS 16, there's one or two exceptions, but under IFRS 16, the default for a lessee entering into a lease is they recognize a right of use asset and a liability, an obligation to make the lease payments. Now, legally, the lessee doesn't own the asset. What it does, though, is have rights to the economic benefits. What it does, though, is it controls the asset for the period of the lease. And that is what we recognize as an asset. That is why IFRS 16 capitalizes a lease for a lessee, because it's a right of use. And that is reflecting a faithful representation. That is reflecting substance over form. If we don't include leases, assets that are leased on the balance sheet, then our balance sheet is incomplete and it's not faithful and we're not recording the liability. So it's a third classic example of the application of a faithful representation. If we want to faithfully represent events and transactions to tell the truth, then we must prepare group accounts. We must apply those principles when deciding whether things are debt or equity. And we must also apply it using lease accounting for lessees. Thank you very much for listening. I hope this has been useful.